Another misconception I don't want to cultivate within myself or my beliefs is evil ultimately ruling the world, because I know that that can't happen. I'm speaking on the reality, and when I say reality, you have to understand what cultivates a reality and know that a human is actually a world which creates other things, just as what we label planets do. And within a reality that many of us share and supports the actions and the operations of the population we live in have, because the universal laws were set in place to run a certain way, and everything is everything, and nothing can intervene and change that. However, the knowledge of this being suppressed does not change the way things currently operate and will always operate and will have always operated. But ultimately, the Creator was not indifferent or malevolent. However, the laws and the cause and effect and the systematic and unrefutable functions of its existence are very much so. That may or may not be an opinionated stance or spiritual belief, but I believe that the Creator was very much benevolent Creator. With it being the Most High, it would only logically be that, seeing as it supports regeneration, creativity, and many other things that stem off of those existing and being cultivated. But in order to ensure the operating of such a large, vast, what we would perceive as space, for the effects to be unavoidable, they would have to be strictly managed. Hence, the obligation within organizations to be prohibited to maneuver themselves in such a way that would conflict with polarization. That's just a magnetized version of the larger existence of the root of what they do. And that's malevolence and evil, operating through manipulation, which is its core of operating. It can't exist otherwise. There's certain things when it comes to diving into, say, phonetics or etymology, or just maritime admiralty law, or double speaking. You get to looking too far into that stuff, especially when you're not involved in any group of people who are in that same vibration as far as your understanding and communicating. It can really just be detrimental at a point, and sometimes chaotic, especially if you let it spill over into your personal life as far as the actions you take towards your business decisions especially. But some of these things are very important to me to keep in mind, and I often forget, and some of them I've been meaning to mention. But as I said, I go through these cycles, and I feel like I'm back at a basic level because of about a week ago where I was at. I mean, I was thinking about some stuff to where I knew it wasn't going to be long, but that's okay because I feel like I've held on to a lot of these things. As far as comprehension, it's just a matter of being able to word them or write them down. But whenever you get into your perception accounting for all the double speaking and phonetics and mistranslations of religious texts, you have to be careful because it can spill over into affecting your psychological health. But it's certain things I feel is better to remember. But it's almost like you have to create two different viewpoints sometimes, but you have to do it less frequent as possible. Make the frequency as low as possible, but never forget about certain words meaning certain things, because if you don't keep it in the back of your mind instead of the front of your mind, it will really affect the way you speak and operate in general, to a point where if you say haven't been doing certain spiritual practices or professional mental evaluations, you shouldn't even attempt. But one of these things I feel that I shouldn't forget is the presence of grace is I am. And many people say that I am ultimately translates to God, and how in previous recordings I've said that we're in a spiritual prison, which we have termed with the word time, which monitors the will, intellect, and emotion of a cultivated consciousness within people that affects their decisions, which ultimately exists naturally as a sort of righteousness that is the compassion that represents the security of our existence. But with I'm or I am, literally and symbolically, actually representing the present moment. For a lack of better terms, I'm using the words present moment because it's more of the presence of grace that I'm speaking of, because it's ultimately a deity that we unknowingly imprison with a certain way of operating, because we all create the present time, the present moment as we label it with the words we use. It's just difficult. You have to create two different viewpoints as you speak, even when you want to teach yourself something. You have to plant a seed, let it cultivate, let it bring you to a certain level of the vibration of understanding, overstanding, and understanding to even attempt to continue and be on the same note or page to create the same conclusion, theories, perceptions, and ways to operate. But with the present moment representing Christ, even through translation and all of this, whether you want it to be God, which created the universal laws that are set in place and the planets and everything that we know it and perceive to be reality, period, or his son Jesus, or the consciousness within all the humans, or all of those in a triune, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, whichever way you wish to look at it. The words create the perception, which creates the spiritual prison in which the deity of the presence of grace, which is the present moment that we all create, it's infinite. Well, in the perception that's taught to us and shared and passed on through generations is the deity we should all look at as our Savior, and the frame of reference created of what to worship, which is ultimately hidden, being the present moment or the presence of grace, is Jesus Christ on the cross, dying for sins and tribulation, of the manipulation of malevolence over benevolence, which is ultimately what it still is. It's not a personal level of characters. Though a lot of scenarios I speak on do exist, it's ultimately not the bigger picture. Like they say, Jesus is in all of us. Or other religions say that I am means I am God, which means you yourself are. I mean, a lot of different viewpoints that are considered to be radical or controversial or just not mainstream are created after this realization of what I am actually means, especially when people make the correlation of Jesus Christ representing it almost covertly in a way, as far as social engineering, in my opinion, influenced. I went way too far into a tangent. I went way too far into a tangent that I didn't even mean to go in. But before I back all the way out of it, I want to do so with retrospect, supporting the symbolism that I perceive within all the phonetics and mistranslations and similarities to other ancient stories and religions before I start focusing on more personal, psychological, therapeutic things. I would still like to wrap this up on the way that I see things, because I feel it ultimately contributes to who I've become and some of the problems I've developed, as well as some strengths I've developed. And I plan to start focusing more on values and how to prioritize and utilize them. But I've just had a lot of stuff in my head as usual, and I really think that I need to take a personal note to immediately grab a pen and paper and write what I'm thinking, so that way I won't encounter the problem of not being able to put it into words, or encountering the problem I'm having now, procrastinating, pulling the recorder out when I had a way to word what I was thinking. Because in taking note of my progression and regression, I've always noticed whenever it comes to the end of the cycle, as far as my thoughts reaching into really theoretical and deeply profound realizations of life and death, and crazy theories that could just be amazing movies, to say the least. I always know whenever all that's happening, a day's coming real soon where my mind is going back to a very basic level of thinking very soon again. And then the progression will begin from there again within the 2 to 3 to 5 to 6 month cycle of getting back to that point again. And it's better to be about a month away from that. That's about the range that I feel that I'm most productive as far as doing this. And it's unfortunate that the cycle goes right back to such a basic level of thinking, because it gets to be so much to where you can barely even put it in words, and it becomes a level of imperativeness, it seems, now that I've caught on to the pattern recognition of the cycle and how it goes back to a basic level of thinking, and there's no way I'm going to be able to word those things. And it was at a level that would have really been good to have backpedaled my way out of a lot of things that could be misconceived within myself when listening to those last few recordings before this one. But that's okay, because I still understand them, I just can't put it into words. But I'd still like to attempt to. If an organization's premise is to hide its existence and or intentions, an efficient and effective attack and tactic would be, when approaching the threat of the victims or targets' realization of the truth in the midst of trying to hinder the development of them revealing the truth to themselves. If they were to have to compromise their strategies, they would continue to let the perception exist, even with it being correct. They would move to shifting the blame to someone that wouldn't be the catalyst that the victims or targets would anticipate. The psychology and surveillance procedures and tactics are more predominantly dependent upon the reading of the electromagnetic field than most would perceive. Not only is individualism a threat, but empathetic behavior is another parallel to the malevolence manipulating the benevolence and siphoning the power. Because empaths feel other people's emotions, which visibly affects and identifies empathetic people's emotions. This can be misperceived and mispresented to people who don't share the same psychology and people who do, because they're using synthetic ways to do this versus ancient ways. I spoke upon this years ago. But as I said, you can take this as literally or as symbolically as you please, seeing as how it all represents the mechanics and the foundation and what it takes, in my opinion, to understand the intricacies of the reality being created and regulated and interpreted and orchestrated within everyone individually, so similarly, to the point that it is what it is, regardless of how you interpret it. And that in itself, through my perception, is validation of the facts that I perceive to be truth. And that's ultimately that evil runs the world through manipulation and siphoning off the energy of benevolence and good intentions. And that there is a story that represents this taking place, seeing as how we have been covertly coerced into assimilating in a syndicated timeline, basically, that supports the narrative of evil ruling the world through malevolence manipulating benevolence. And that is symbolized through Jesus and how he was persecuted and how he died on the cross, and how that same set of events and circumstances and scenarios are cultivated and played out for people to symbolically represent that happening within that story. And that has to take place in order for the reality that we perceive to happen. in this country especially, but all over the world too, because the same thing happens through their religions. And it's just about keeping the entire human race stuck in the vibration that we're in, as far as evil ruling the world through manipulation of the benevolence of good intentions and things like Christ consciousness, or people who try to be Christ-like, or people who would rather sacrifice their self or hurt their self before participate in hurting other people. Because in order for evil to do what it's doing now, it has to keep us in that loop because of the stories and the things that we believe now. It can only operate in that vibration within a certain frame of reference in us, and we unknowingly support that to continue because it represents a certain point in the story that we're in, that we continue and are stuck in our own brains. Even if you don't believe what I'm saying or look at it symbolically or literally, you can't ignore how through translation of the Bible, for instance, I'm just saying how history has been misinterpreted and misrepresented and sometimes made up. But in the Bible, for example, you can't ignore the fact that much of the stories have been removed completely, and a lot of the messages portrayed have been misrepresented through translations. And it's all to support the narratives that we all have a consensus on in regards to what we do and how things are. But ever since the decision was made to continue to keep us in the point of the timeline that creates the perception we live in, there have been multiple people that have came along to change the events within the time frame and story that we perceive to be reality. I mean, just look at it like a dream. Like an individual goes to sleep and they're in a coma, and that dream just continues to progress because they don't wake up. The events continue to happen, and all these different characters come along within that story. Well, in order to keep that person asleep and that dream to continue, for example, this being a metaphor, the people that come along during this reality that we've been born in, that perpetually continues, in order to do that, they have to recreate these people again in society. For example, like Napoleon or Machiavelli or Hitler or Manson, or just anyone who was made out in history to have changed events, or who did. Seeing as how we are in that of a dream in the metaphor that I'm correlating these occurrences I'm speaking of. They have to continue to recreate these characters that have the potential to change events that affect the actions of other people. Because in order to diminish something's power, you have to mimic it. Because otherwise, if it's mimicked for another reason, it would be to strengthen it, like a religion, for instance, or a practice, or a sport. It's always to hit off or intercept or contracept or eradicate the effects of the way things already run in order to accomplish detrimenting the odds of that consciousness changing events at all again, but more importantly, creating circumstances that could potentially make the story that has already been created continue, because they want to at least plan around when they anticipate it happening so that they can be prepared for when it does, so that they can hone in on their game plans that they are creating the blueprints and finishing up now during this time that we've been stuck in, with our perception being what it is, keeping us doing what we do because of what we believe and what we've been lied to about. Because these people could come along who change the events in this way or that way, which were either preyed upon from the beginning and led to foundations of things supporting us being stuck here in this vibration or reality or perception, or things that will be establishments that are used to regulate what their game plans are that they will finish up during this time. They want things to go one way when what they can't change starts to change. They have to keep the knowledge at a certain level. They have to keep our behavior a certain way. There has to be an exact amount of everything exactly the same fucking way. And they're trying to assassinate individualism in the process, because that's where a lot of their problems stem from, because they want everyone's will, intellect, and emotion to be the same or gone completely. So never let the irony blind you as far as these influential people who changed things being recreated. Even if it were to be happen genuinely through reincarnation, they would still mimic those people. It's never to make them more influential. It's never to make them have another chance to change things. It simply happens to trap them here and eradicate the power of scenarios being created to make the odds of certain consciousness or personalities or people coming into this world to let the story progress or change the events within the timeline that we are perpetually in a loop in. It's like they manipulate certain individuals who have had influence on the population in the past. That's how they became as influential as they were in some cases. It's just from the orchestrated events and the manipulated perception that was cultivated in them. So they account for that by creating circumstances that do that on autopilot, or they can recreate those circumstances to create that personality, just since that has been accounted for. Like, they anticipate people to become certain people sometimes, and then situations where people weren't manipulated into being the person that they were, they create situations in which they manipulate someone to become that person and then put them in a situation that would be adverse to them because of them preparing for who that person is and how they reacted to their life the first time, or how people with that personality adapt in the grand scheme of things to detriment them or potentially harm or kill them. But it all leads me back to the concept of us focusing on the same concepts perpetually, as if we're not finishing the story, and how the aspect of Jesus dying on the cross is more focused upon than what he did while he was here. It's more about what did he die for, and it leads you to the conclusion that he was sent here to die for our sins. Well, in order to die, and the stories that we've been told in the Bible, or the history that's been accounted for, whichever viewpoint, because I'm just trying to focus on the spiritual aspect of me and the perspective that I've developed that I'm sure other people have, seeing as how many of the circumstances are so similar. In order to not complete the story, it's to continue to support the reality that we live in on a mass scale, as far as what we believe and the terms we use and the knowledge that's distributed and hidden. You have all these people that come along over time after the process of this particular facet and level of progression of this agenda, or whatever you would want to label it. It's just another set of terms and words and labels. It really doesn't matter. It's the concept that matters. It's the mechanics of the systems with the same goals and end games, whether they're manipulated or intended. These people come along after this timeline has been published and we've became covertly syndicated characters. Whether you want to take that literally or symbolically, both are happening at the same time. Like, there is a reality of that happening on a literal level and a symbolic level simultaneously, and that's how it happens and continues to happen. After these decisions were made to begin this part of the process of the end game of these agendas that were set in place thousands of years ago through the malevolence manipulating the benevolence of humans and creating this spiritual prison that monitors the will, intellect, and emotion of the population with the intent of assassinating individualism. After this particular aspect of this agenda being taken place, you have all these iconic people and many other people who are Kafkaesque in nature, and many people that probably never get the credit, which, in my opinion, according to the balances that are set in place due to the universe's rules, have a more powerful effect anyway towards progression and battling the manipulation of people's good intentions or personal progress. All these people that come along that do anything to oppose or change events at all, whether they be towards something detrimental or beneficial, after the decision was made to continue keeping us in the reality that we live in, that's based on the timeline that we're stuck in, these people have to be recreated, because after they die, whether they were, in my opinion, influential or not, it's just a matter of them creating circumstances and the scenarios that they lived in that changed the events in the world in such a way that shifted the direction of other people's intentions and led to founding other establishments that could potentially oppose keeping us locked into the same vibration, locked into the same storyline, locked into the same perception, locked into this reality. They have to mimic and recreate and infiltrate all of these things and people and sometimes events, especially biblical and spiritual conceptual perceptions, in order to keep us locked into all of that. It's almost as if the first tangible decision they made doing that was just persecuting people's will, intellect, and emotion, because in the timeline of the Bible, for instance, that's what was happening. It's not just about people who come along that could threaten the power's influence on the masses that keeps them locked into the storyline and timeline that covertly makes them syndicated characters that have literary property, basically, which just manipulates everything that they think is true. It's not just about keeping people here in this reality as it is and as we perceive it and believe it to be so. It's about finishing the process of what started, that they're trying to manipulate, eradicate, and misrepresent to people. They mimic things to diminish the power of what they mimic or the influence of what they mimic may have. The way I see it, it's more of a question of snapping us out of that perception and progressing the way things were intended to, or would it just be a dangerous awareness of the spiritual prison that we don't know how to escape from? Because in a way we created ourselves, but it's the strength of the foundations that instill these beliefs that create the perceptions we have. Because as I said, what we perceive to be strength when it comes to these powerful things that we may or may not perceive to be evil, it's a matter of whether they're siphoning off the energy of other people, or are they creating energy in other people. And it comes back to all the wordplay. This is not new to anyone. I mean, anything I say is always something I've heard from someone else, if it's not something that I've discovered on my own. And it's just like, I don't mention names, because who's to say if I would give them a bad reputation or not, seeing as I don't know what mine is, but I anticipate that it's a negative one based on the circumstances around me. So I don't want to negatively represent anyone unintentionally, but it's about more wordplay, and it's conspire and inspire. Inspire meaning going back to the root of respiratory system, and con meaning to detriment, and in meaning to add to. So do you want to inspire someone, or do you want to conspire against them? Do you want to breathe life into them, or do you want to take life away through their own breath? And the concept that good has no power over evil is simply the paradigm that we've been trapped in, that I've termed a spiritual prison called time, in which the term is that of purgatory to some people. But more importantly, it's, in my viewpoint and opinion of the things that I think about and assess and analyze, it's a time to plan for all the things that they're going to do after they let the story continue. Because it's not even really them letting the story continue. It's not even them making the story continue to start over perpetually in the same starting point and ending point. It's us. But as I said, it's been so embedded in the roots of all these organizations that we're just born around and unfortunately born into without knowing. But I feel that they're using this time to keep us a certain way and to cleanse us of people who aren't that way, but more importantly, to grow the population of people that are that certain way, so that they will have predominance over the progression of things, which they ultimately have no control over. They just know how to manipulate the circumstances of what's already existing. Everything still happens the way it's supposed to. It's just a matter of it being kept the way it is. And this is the beginning stages of eradicating anything that could change any potential avenues that could eradicate the seeds being sown of the existing predominance of the negative mentalities that multiplied in order to overpower what was being manipulated and siphoned off here in this time period.